Professor Edward Chen, Professor Chen, Professor Ma, distinguished panelists, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a great honor for me to be invited by Professor Edward Chen to deliver this distinguished lecture for this year. And I've known Professor Chen for more than 17 years, I believe. So it's really a pleasure for me to give this lecture series. What I will focus on is basically the risk from volatile capital flows. The title of the, can we have the slide up on the screen, please? Okay, thank you very much. So the title of the lecture is East Asia Economic Stability at Bay, the Role of International Cooperation. And what I will talk about is basically, I will highlight some of the things that I've been personally involved in relation to this topic. So the main points is, first of all, just briefly talk about the challenges from volatile capital flows, particularly for emerging market economies. And then, as a tribute to Thailand's great king Bhumibol Adulyadej, who passed away 1 month ago, I will talk about his philosophy of the sufficiency economy, which he used to teach the Thai people about appropriate conduct after the Asia financial crisis. And then I will talk about policies at the country level, particularly policies that have changed since the financial crisis in 1997 in different areas. And then finally talk about international cooperation, whether at the bilateral, global, or regional level. Now, in this part of the world, we are used to the risks from volatile capital flow. In fact, Thailand started the Asia financial crisis in the early 90s. That was a time when financial globalization really started, and we witnessed a lot of capital flows in the form of foreign borrowing coming into the region. And this led to economic bubble in many countries, particularly in the case of Thailand. And eventually the bubble burst and then the capital flow reversed. So this led to a major economic crisis. After the crisis, there have also been periods of large and rapid short-term capital inflows. So both outflows and inflows create problems. And we see that this has created challenges to many economies. And we can see from the global financial crisis that there was also large capital outflows after the closure of Lehman Brothers. So when capital inflow came in, countries would find it the challenge to manage the capital inflow, because this leads to possibility of exchange rate strengthening and so on. But when the capital flows reverse, this also creates a lot of problems. And you can see from recent events that even in the case of China, where they had reserves of up to $4 trillion US, that amount doesn't seem so large now, because last year they lost a huge amount with capital outflow. And this year also, China is still facing situations of capital outflows. Now, emerging market economies are particularly vulnerable to capital flows. First of all, these are economies that are growing relatively fast with plenty of investment opportunities for capital inflows. And also, moderate flows can lead to large changes in exchange rate and asset prices. Relatively few hedging instruments in the case of volatility in exchange rates. And domestic participants are not so sophisticated. Also, authorities are not so knowledgeable in dealing with these volatilities compared to authorities in advanced economy. And what can happen is that when you have capital inflows and outflow, this can lead to movements of relative exchange rate between countries in the same region who are competing against each other, and this can create difficulties. This graph shows the exchange rate trend during the global financial crisis. The top line there is the exchange rate index for South Korea. The higher the line, the weaker the exchange rate. And you can see that Korea at that time faced large capital outflows, and that's why their exchange rate weakened substantially. The other line that a slight hill underneath the Korean line is Indonesia, which also faced similar difficulties. And you can see that when you have large outflow, the exchange rate can weaken substantially, but then if situation gets back to more normal times, then the exchange rate can realign with the other countries. And this was the exchange rate during the ECB quantitative easing announcement. And you can see the countries in this region had different ways of managing the exchange rate. So there was a divergence in relative exchange rate. For example, compare Thailand to Malaysia, Singapore, there was divergence. And this makes it difficult because our region are competitive with each other, and also we have close integration. Now, after the Asian financial crisis, prior to the Asian financial crisis, you can see that there was excessive behavior in all kinds of behavior. There were excessive consumption, excessive investment, excessive debt built up, and this eventually led to the burst of the bubble and the global financial crisis, and the Asian financial crisis. So the graph here shows household saving rate, and you can see that as we approach the crisis, the household saving rate declined as we consuming more and more. Secondly, investment became less productive. So if you look at total factor productivity, which is productivity of the economy after taking into account changes in factor input, you can see that in between 1991 and 1995, in the period before the financial crisis, it was actually negative. And then at the bottom graph that shows excessive short-term foreign debt. So we borrowed a huge amount of money from abroad in terms of foreign currency, and this led to a problem because you can see the green line there is the foreign reserves. So foreign reserve actually became less than short-term foreign debt. Short-term foreign debt means debt that has maturity of less than 1 year. Okay. So the question is, if the foreign lenders do not extend the debt, then you don't have enough foreign reserve to repay. And that was really the fundamental problem with the case of Thailand. Over several decades prior to the crisis, Thailand's late King Bhumibol had suggested the philosophy of the sufficiency economy in remarks on many occasions as a guidance for appropriate conduct covering numerous aspects of life. After the economic crisis, His Majesty reiterated and expanded on the philosophy as a way that will reduce excesses and lead to a more resilient and sustainable economy, better able to meet challenges arising from globalization and other changes. But when the king talked about the philosophy, he used examples of real people that he met, of real projects that happened. And so he didn't talk in terms of conceptual framework, but he was talking about examples of various things. And this led to people interpreting the philosophy in very different ways. At that time, because of the crisis, there was a feeling in the country by quite a lot of people that globalization was a bad thing, that Thailand should turn its back on globalization and become self-sufficient. So this led to a lot of concern about trying to make sure that people understand the philosophy of the sufficiency economy. So at the initiative of one of the Privy Council, a working group of about 10 people was set up to try to distill the essence of the philosophy, and I was privileged to be one of that group. And so in the end, a summary official statement of the philosophy of the sufficiency economy was drafted, and this is just a very short one paragraph. So it says, sufficiency economy is a philosophy that stresses the middle path as the overriding principle for appropriate conduct by the populace at all levels. This applies to conduct at the level of the individual, families, and communities, as well as to the choice of a balanced development strategy for the nation, so as to modernize in line with the forces of globalization, while shielding against inevitable shocks and excesses that arise. Sufficiency means moderation and due consideration in all modes of conduct, as well as the need for sufficient protection from internal and external shocks. To achieve this, the application of knowledge with prudence is essential. In particular, great care is needed in the utilization of untested theories and methodologies for planning and implementation. At the same time, it is essential to strengthen the moral fiber of the nation so that everyone, particularly political and public officials, academics, businessmen, and financiers, adheres first and foremost to the principles of honesty and integrity. In addition, a balanced approach combining patience, perseverance, diligence, wisdom, and prudence is indispensable to cope appropriately with critical challenges arising from extensive and rapid socioeconomic, environmental, and cultural changes occurring as a result of the globalization. After this was drafted, permission was asked from the king to disseminate, and then we had a letter from the principal private secretary at that time saying that the king has examined the draft, he made some correction, and he allowed it to be distributed. And therefore, this is, I would say, an official version, although this is unofficial translation. You can apply this to all levels of conduct, and here is based on my interpretation. There are a number of key principles. First of all, wants that are not excessive. If you demand unending amount of wants, more power, more money, then it's unlikely that this will be consistent with the philosophy of sufficiency economy. Also, setting targets should be based on due consideration and set at appropriate level, which is not too excessive. If you set targets as excessive, then you would carry out behavior that will maybe overdone in terms of too much excesses to try to achieve unrealistic target, and this can lead to a lot of problems. And then importantly, third is the need for sufficient protection from risk, because there are always risks in all modes of life, and so you have to think, how can I protect myself or ourselves from the risks? And the application of knowledge with prudence, the fourth point. So the environment under which decisions need to be made tend to be very complex. It is therefore necessary to be very careful and thorough before making decisions. And the fifth is the principle of honesty and integrity. Obviously, without this, it would be almost impossible to abide by the philosophy of sufficiency economy. We can also look at this philosophy in terms of macroeconomic policy. First of all, how can we have macroeconomic framework that can prevent excesses in the economic system? Prior to the 1997 crisis, the macroeconomic policy framework in Thailand was really leading to excess rather than to try to prevent excess. At that time, in the technical jargon, it says that the Thai policy framework was of the so-called Mandel Impossible Trinity. Professor Mandel is a former Nobel Prize winner who wrote about this in the 60s, that the kind of policy that Thailand used at that time would lead to problems. So that was a macro framework that did not protect against risk. And also you need to have realistic assessment of the country's potential. Before the crisis, we were saying that we're going to be growing at 9%, 10% for the next 10, 20 years. And because of that, that led to spending, over-investing, etc. And that led to a lot of problems. Investment strategy also should be moderate and careful. Again, we over-invested. We try to invest in huge projects, both by the public and private sector. And then in the end, all of these projects fail. And finally, need for self-protection from risk. Here, apart from domestic policy of the individual country, there can also be role of international cooperation, which we will talk about later. Now, I'll talk a little bit about key policy areas after the Asian financial crisis, and there are 4 areas. First area is on more flexible exchange rate. Second, the inflation targeting framework. Third, exchange rate management, and 4, reserves accumulation. We in Thailand have used fixed exchange rate regime ever since the 50s, and it's been very successful. But where the problem arose is when we moved into a world of financial globalization. Real globalization based on trade of goods, services, and flows of FDI don't create so much problem. But flows of capital, particularly short-term capital, they can move so quickly, and really it leads to all kinds of risks. Also, we saw in the 80s and also the 90s that when you have a fixed exchange rate system, politicians tend to resist needed devaluation when necessary. Somehow they feel that if you devalue your currency, then you lose face. It means that the policy that the country is using is a failure. That was the thinking at that time. And that's why countries tend to try to defend the exchange rate more than they should. And that can lead to crisis, whether in Thailand, 1997, or even when I was studying in the UK during the 60s, exactly the same problem, unwillingness to devalue in time. In fact, now we can see that depreciation actually has a lot of benefit. It means you can deal a lot more better with capital outflow, and also if your currency depreciates, your export goes up. And this can help in terms of turning around your economy. When the baht was floated after 1997, because we ran out of foreign reserves, a monetary anchor is needed. And most countries use, under a flexible exchange rate, use a kind of inflation targeting framework. So this has to be set up because before that we did not have any legal framework at all on inflation targeting. So the first Monetary Policy Committee was formally set up in 2000, and I was, again, privileged to be on that particular committee to develop the inflation targeting framework for Thailand. It was important at that time to make sure that the new framework can gain credibility from the market. Okay? The target we chose was on core inflation. Core inflation is excluding raw food and energy prices. Because these raw food and energy prices can be quite volatile, and Thailand is an agricultural exporting country, so when, say, the price of agriculture goes up, this can drive up inflation, headline inflation, and we don't want to suddenly have to increase interest rate to bring down the inflation rate, because Thailand is benefiting from the increase in agricultural prices. So the core inflation target we set was not a point target, but a range. And the range was deliberately set to be large. So at that time, it was 0 to 3.5%. Okay? And then over time, as we gain more confidence, the range was slightly narrowed to 0.5 to 3%. And after almost 15 years of inflation targeting with core inflation, Thailand's core inflation rate went outside the range for only a few months, as you can see from this graph. So this is from 2000 to 2015. Core inflation managed to retain. And this gave credibility and confidence to the market. Later, after 2015, the Bank of Thailand changed the target from core to headline. This seems to be a move in central banks around the world that people don't understand core inflation. They understand headline because that's what you go and buy in the shops. But that was bad timing because 2016 was a time that inflation became negative for almost a whole year. So that led to some credibility problem. However, because the range was large, if inflation is in the, say, somewhere in the middle of the range, then obviously other targets can be pursued. It's not just inflation, because if you're in the middle, you can pursue maybe growth could be more important at that time. And there were times where there were very strong policy conflicts between the Bank of Thailand and the Ministry of Finance or the Minister of Finance. Because usually the Bank of Thailand, as a central bank, they tend to be rather conservative. So they don't want to reduce interest rates quickly at the first sign that inflation is subsiding. Whereas the government is more interested in trying to lower interest rate to promote growth, and therefore there can be real conflict. And there were particularly these two periods. First period was in 2006, and that was when there were a lot of capital inflows into Thailand, so the baht strengthened a lot. So the Ministry of Finance wanted to try to make sure that the baht doesn't get too strong. So they want the Bank of Thailand to lower interest rates quickly, but the Bank of Thailand did not. So that was the time when the staff of the central bank, of the Ministry of Finance, were writing newspaper articles attacking Bank of Thailand. and the Bank of Thailand was writing articles attacking the Ministry of Finance. It was a complete mess. 2006, huge inflow, and in the end, the Bank of Thailand said that we cannot deal with the strengthening of the baht. So Thailand introduced capital controls in December 2006, which means if you want to bring the money into the country to invest, say in stock market or in, say, bonds and whatever, you have to withhold 30%. You cannot use 30% to invest. And also you have to keep your money in the country for 1 year. Otherwise you lose 10% of your investment. So the next day, the stock market crashed by 15%. So within 24 hours, the policy was reversed. So the money that came into the stock market does not have to go through the capital control. This led to all kinds of problems, credibility. Anyway, at the beginning of 2007, the Minister of Finance resigned. And I was then asked at that time to become the Minister of Finance. So I didn't introduce capital control, although I had to live with it because it was there when I came in. The other period, number 2 there, is very similar. Again, Bank of Thailand, Minister of Finance wants to reduce interest rate quickly. And Minister of Finance gave interviews to the media almost every day. They say, I want to sack the governor. I want to sack the governor. But luckily for the governor, the Bank of Thailand Act that was passed during my time in office gave a lot of protection to the Bank of Thailand, so you cannot really be sacked easily. Before that, you can be sacked simply by the minister going to the cabinet meeting and say, for appropriate reason, we want to change the Minister of Finance. Now you cannot. Second, next area is on exchange rate management. So large inflow can lead to rapid appreciation of the exchange rate. And this can lead to loss of competitiveness by countries that rely heavily on export, like Thailand. And also the short-term inflow can easily reverse, therefore a country must protect themselves from that reversal. Exchange rate intervention, meaning when money comes in, the foreign exchange comes into the country, then the central bank can buy it up. So therefore this prevents the currency from strengthening. So, and also this will increase reserves to deal with the situation where the capital flow reverse. Because once it reverses, you need the exchange foreign reserve to be able to stabilize the exchange rate. So this really can have a lot of costs, because when foreign money comes in, the government buys it up, and then more local currency, more Thai baht goes into the system, so they have to issue bond to mop up the liquidity, otherwise that may lead to high inflation. And the problem is that the foreign reserve earn interest similar to what you get from US Treasury bill, which is very low, almost zero. Whereas the cost of mopping up the liquidity has a higher interest rate. Therefore, it costs more. So this has fiscal implication, and that's why many times the Ministry of Finance wants reduction in interest rate to help reduce inflows. So other tools can also be very useful, and I think Hong Kong has used some macroprudential tools, particularly for inflows into speculate on property markets and so on, for example. Thailand has not used that much, but this certainly is a very important tool. And capital control measures can also be used, but you have to be well designed. No, not like in the case of Thailand in 2006. We simply borrowed some policy that Chile used in the early 90s without understanding the changes in the financial markets since then. So the key thing is reserves very important. If a country is believed that it doesn't have enough reserves, then speculators will come in and they will speculate on your currency lowering, or even lead to inadequate reserve can lead to a major crisis. So accumulating reserve is also very important. In recent time, the IMF has been doing some research on what amount of reserve should be adequate for countries. Okay, I won't go into the formula, but basically it's still based on relatively benign view of how capital volatility behaves. For a country, and they suggested from this formula that reserve should be in the range of 100 to 100% of the metric as calculated by the formula. But for a country like Thailand that went through the crisis in '97, and I can tell you that it has huge and profound impact. It took 12 years before Thailand's real per capita GDP, measured in real US dollar, got back to the pre-crisis level. You lose 12 years. And so if you've been through that experience, you're certainly not going to be following the IMF metric, certainly not 100 to 150. But in the case of Thailand, the research in 2012 came to about 250% of the metric. So this is normal, because a country has been through a crisis, has been through huge pain. It's normal that they would guard themselves against repeating the mistake of the past. In fact, accumulating reserve is not the thing that happened in Thailand. Almost every country in East Asia has been accumulating reserve. So here, the top line there is China. And you can see the scale is on the right side. China went up to almost 4 trillion. 4 trillion is million, is trillion. 4 trillion US dollar reserve. But then last year, lots of outflow, and so you can see the reserve came down. So in hindsight, we say 4 trillion is not too high for China because it could reverse anytime. And when it reverses quickly and a large amount. And also, if you look at ASEAN, also accumulating reserve, although in recent years been again declining a bit. Again, this shows that reserve accumulation is really something that countries should give a lot of importance to because it can reverse. And the other lines are for Japan and South Korea. Okay. In Korea, in 2008, when they went into almost a kind of liquidity problem, you see they had too few reserve. So after that, they learned. So their accumulated reserve increased very rapidly. In terms of the ratio of foreign service GDP, China, while reserves is large, in terms of relation to GDP, is about 31%. Thailand, in fact, is much bigger, 39.6 in 2015. So again, we accumulated a lot of reserves. Okay, so I've talked about policy at the country level. And of course, each country will need to lay down the appropriate policy framework to protect yourselves from volatile capital flows. So we now talk about international cooperation at different levels. First level is bilateral safety net. Bilateral safety net was very important in stabilizing situation for a number of countries after the closure of Lehman Brothers. And that was a period of shortage of US dollar globally. Korea was affected quite severely, as I mentioned, and also Indonesia. And while in this part of the world we had bilateral swap agreement, so-called Chiang Mai Initiative, because it was signed in the year 2000 in Chiang Mai, Thailand. This bilateral swaps that we had in the region was still tied a lot to the IMF. And countries in this part of the world, they don't want to be involved much with the IMF anymore because they had bad experience after 1997. So Korea instead got bilateral swap from the United States Federal Reserve. So Korea got a swap with the US Fed of about 30 billion US dollar. And this led to more stabilization in currency, but then as the currency already weakened, Korean export increased and imports decreased, and so the situation in Korea turned around. So it was thought at that time that bilateral swap with the Fed was very important. Unfortunately, Indonesia also requested a swap with the US Fed, but US Fed refused because it didn't go along with US interests as much as the swap with Korea. Instead, Indonesia got help from Japan and China. Okay. Now, because bilateral swap seems to be quite effective during the global financial crisis, many countries have been moving to do more and more swap in terms of bilateral swap. For example, Korea in 2011 expanded its US dollar 13 billion bilateral swap with Japan to a total of about 70 billion. And there were many other expansion of bilateral swap. Indonesia also has at least 22.76 billion with Japan, and also 16 billion with China. China has become a major provider of bilateral swaps, certainly to emerging market economies. China currently has bilateral swap agreement with more than 30 countries, totaling about $500 billion in value. And by these are local currency swap, i.e. yuan against, say, local currency baht. But because China has a huge foreign reserve, maybe this could be converted to US dollar if there was a need to do so. So therefore, bilateral swap has been seen to be things a country may help themselves, giving more safety nets. However, bilateral swaps are inevitably political. If you suddenly have political problem between the two countries, then the bilateral swap can disappear overnight. And this was demonstrated by the reduction and eventual lapse of the swap between Japan and Korea in February of last year, because they had some disagreement about the nationality of certain islands that both countries claim, and so this can lead to a complete reversal or lapse of the swap. So bilateral swap, while it can be useful, but one should be careful in not relying on it totally. Okay. So the next level is on global level. And global level here, obviously, the IMF is a global organization that looks at the global financial stability. The IMF, after the global financial crisis, introduced a couple of credit lines that countries can have access to when they have problems with liquidity. So the first one is called flexible credit line. This is for those countries with very strong fundamentals, okay, as judged by the IMF. If you apply and the IMF says your policy have very strong fundamental, then you are able to have access to this flexible credit line. At the lower level, but those with strong fundamentals, with still some policy vulnerabilities, may qualify for precautionary and liquidity lines. These lines are not for dealing with a country in crisis. Okay, it's a country having some liquidity problem, but not in a crisis. They can have access to these lines to tie them over periods when they have liquidity problems. But however, not many countries are interested. So in the case of the flexible credit line, only 3 countries so far, Poland, Mexico, and Colombia, have applied and qualified for the flexible credit line. And only Morocco and Republic of Macedonia, 2 countries, have applied and qualified for the precautionary and liquidity line. Now this is a problem because these facilities are meant to be global facilities. And if you only have 3 or 2 countries interested, then really it's not working. And in the review in early 2014 of these facilities, IMF staff admitted that IMF stigma is still a major issue for many emerging market economies, particularly in East Asia and Latin America. Stigma meaning that countries feel that if they go into an IMF program again, they will be looked upon by the public as being very weak. And again, we went through very bad experience in 1997, 98. Why do we want to go back there again? And this is the problem with these facilities. So it says some emerging markets feeling vulnerable to heightened capital flow volatility, but unwilling to request fund arrangement, are seeking to expand regional financing arrangement and network of bilateral swap agreement. Okay. It's easy to understand the IMF stigma, and I think there should be a rethink of these facilities about how countries can have access to these facilities when they need it. I think it can be redesigned based on 3 principles. First of all, to be objective. Second, to be transparent. And third, to be automatic. Because the current facility, you still have to go through the IMF board, and we know that there are lots of politics involved. So, if it goes, and European countries and US have huge voting power, so they can block these facilities easily. So it should be designed to more to be objective. That is having certain kind of formula in which countries will know how much they can qualify automatically. And think of this, this is not for dealing with the crisis. This is to tie over a country when they have liquidity problems. And even if a country has a lot of reserves, it doesn't mean they can access and use all that reserve as, overnight. Because if they try to, for example, convert their reserves into local currency by selling the assets they're holding in US dollar, then this will have huge implications for the US bond market. So essentially, sometime, if you have another facility, then country can use it at a cost, of course. And this will help them as a new tool to deal with liquidity shortages. So the criteria should really depend on ability to repay, i.e., if you have likely ability to repay, then it should be almost automatic. For example, if a country wants to borrow, say, 1% or even 10% of its reserve for a period of 3 months, then it should be almost automatic, because in 3 months, the probability of the country not being able to repay is very small. Okay? So this kind of thing should be thought about. And if this kind of facility was available during the global financial crisis, then Korea could have had access to about 20 to 30 billion. Therefore, this facility could have been used instead of having to go to the Federal Reserves. Okay. Now, if a country wants more and wants more longer maturity, then of course there will be more condition. That, if you want long, then maybe it's no longer a liquidity problem. Maybe it's a real crisis problem. So this is, therefore, keep flexibility in design of this particular system. Okay, so that's at the global level. So lastly, I come to the regional safety nets. As I mentioned earlier, we had a series of bilateral swap called the Chiang Mai Initiative, which was initiated in the year 2000. And it was already accepted at the time that this bilateral swap is like a spaghetti bowl, countries in this region. So, 13 countries plus Hong Kong having bilateral swap with each other, it's just too cumbersome. So the idea was already there that this should be converted to a multilateral system, i.e. under a single agreement, the whole region can have access to this liquidity pool. So in 2007, when I was Minister of Finance, I attended the Minister of Finance of ASEAN Plus 3 meeting in Kyoto. And that was a meeting that endorsed the multilateralization of the Chiang Mai Initiative. So it's now called Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization, CMIM. So basically, that's in principle, we agree to do that. And then the details will work in subsequent years. So we now have Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization, CMIM. These are so-called self-managed, meaning that countries don't actually pay real money into a pool, but they're committed to paying into a pool if somebody wants to borrow from the pool. So if somebody wants to borrow from a pool, then countries in the region, they have their quota percentage that they will contribute. So that's agreed. But actual money don't go until there's a program. The total amount, not bad, 240 billion. Okay? And this can easily be double because it's not real money. It's simply commitment to pay, even the need arises. And also, what was set up also is the ASEAN Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office, AMRO, was established in April 2011, based in Singapore. And this is to carry out economic and surveillance of the ASEAN Plus 3 region. And that's Japan, China, Korea, 10 countries in Southeast Asia, and including Hong Kong. Okay, so in fact, they do reports on the state of these economies and also regional reports. And as of earlier this year, February 2016, AMRO has now been transformed into an international organization, i.e. countries have now ratified the charter. All countries in the region have done that. And AMRO has a task to monitor, assess, and prepare quarterly reports on the macroeconomic situation and financial soundness of ASEAN Plus 3 countries, assess macroeconomic and financial vulnerabilities in any of the ASEAN Plus 3 countries, and provide assistance in timely formulation of policy recommendations to mitigate such risks. And third, ensure compliance of swap requesting parties with the lending covenants under the CMAM agreement. So AMRO produced quarterly regional economic monitoring reports with monthly updates and country surveillance reports on each of the ASEAN plus 3 countries plus Hong Kong twice a year. And some thematic studies are also carried out. A 6-member advisory panel from each plus 3 country, i.e. China, Japan, Korea, and 3 representing ASEAN countries also give advice to AMRO in their surveillance report. And I was again privileged to have been a member of the advisory panel for 2 terms, the maximum 2 terms, 4 years. And during the 4 years, I was chairing the panel for 2 of the 4 years. The reports, after advice from the advisory panel, are then submitted to the executive committee, who are basically the ASEAN plus 3 finance and central bank deputies. And this goes into the so-called ASEAN plus 3 Economic Review and Policy Dialogue, ERPD, which takes place in biannual meetings of the ASEAN plus 3 finance and central bank deputies meeting, and is reported to the annual ASEAN plus 3 finance ministers meeting and central bank meeting. In my opinion, after being associated with AMRO for 4 years, I think they have provided significant value added to the ASEAN plus 3 surveillance process. Effective surveillance is very difficult because usually when a crisis happens, it's based on new events compared to what you already see in the past. So one can have different viewpoints about whether situation is close to a crisis or not. And effective surveillance at the official level becomes almost impossible. In official meeting, each country will present its view, and then if some countries say, you know, what about this and that, the country will say, oh, don't worry, it's under control. Because no country will admit that their policy is going to lead to a crisis. Whereas AMRO is independent, or at least that's in theory, it's independent. Therefore, it can be more independent in its report. And also to be effective, AMRO should take a more cautionary or pessimistic stance. It wouldn't do any good if AMRO simply say, oh, everything's fine. It should pick on things where, you know, there's some possibility of doubt and then highlight it. But of course, this can lead to antagonism between AMRO and countries. Because countries say, you don't understand my country. That's why you see the risk. Whereas in fact, the country is doing fine. And that's, you know, the value added is to say, maybe the country is not doing fine. And this can lead to value added in the discussions about the surveillance and so on. And now I think that after 5 years now, the executive committee is now understand that for AMRO to be worth the money that they spend on it, then it has to be more pessimistic. And so we're getting more substantive discussion and debates among countries in AMRO in the surveillance process. However, there are still many areas for improvement. So AMRO still needs to develop its technicality, technical expertise, etc. That goes without saying. And AMRO needs more visibility in the business and financial markets and the research community as well. If you talk to officials or academics in East Asia region, have you heard of AMRO? They'll say, oh, ABN AMRO? No, not ABN AMRO. But that's why, because at the moment, AMRO has been more of an in-house surveillance process for the finance and central bank deputies. So it needs now to become more visible in the public eye. Because now, AMRO is an international organization. It's using real money. So taxpayers in all the countries are actually contributing to running AMRO. And therefore, it then needs to be more visible, to be more transparent, to report what it's doing, why is it of benefit to the people paying the money and so on. So that is happening. And then in the past, AMRO has been prevented from publishing, you know, any reports because of fear that maybe the report will highlight weakness of certain countries that will lead to market volatilities and so on. But in my 4 years with AMRO, there have been at most two cases when I thought the information may be a bit too sensitive to release, whereas 99% should be released. And I think this is to be worked out about what kind of things can be released. The current director of AMRO is a Chinese lady, Dr. Chen, who came from the Ministry of Finance. And I think she understands very well how to take AMRO forward. So I think things are moving in the right direction. The key thing now is there are two facilities for CMIM. One is the crisis resolution facility. This is like a country goes through a crisis and you need money to shore up the country to help resolve the crisis, like an IMF package. That, I think, is still linked to the IMF, and it should be linked to the IMF, because having a facility to deal with a crisis is not easy, and you may have to impose strong conditionality, which may be difficult for countries in the region to deal with each other to do that. But if with the IMF involved, then that may be easier. What I think is more important for AMRO in moving ahead is this so-called crisis prevention facility. So it's a CMIM precautionary line, similar to the IMF facilities there. And the qualification criteria remain to be finalized. In the past, unfortunately, the qualification criteria tended to follow the IMF facilities. And as I mentioned, the IMF facilities don't work because people don't want to take the IMF exam, basically. If you apply for IMF exam, what happens if they say no? Then you lose face, and maybe if that news leaks out to the market, there will be a lot of market reaction. Or if they qualify, what happens if later on their policy became very bad? Are you going to then withdraw the qualification? If you withdraw again, there's lots of problem. So I think the CMMPL facility should really move in a different way, and it should be more easier for countries to have access. In principle, regional facilities should be easier for members than global facility. And that's because with the regional facilities, you have more contagion among the region. So if Thailand goes into a crisis again, then all the East Asian economies will suffer, probably even more than 97. And therefore, because of that, countries in the same region should be willing to take more risk, that is, have easier access than the global facility. Otherwise, there's no point. And here, I think, because of the sense of ownership, it means that countries attach importance to regional facilities. And here, we can look at experience of another regional fund that has been operating for almost 35 years. It's called the Latin American Reserve Fund, or FLAR. It only has 8 member countries, relatively small countries, but they pay real money into a pool. So the amount of paid in capital now is around 3.3 billion, and this is real money. And FLAR, or FLAR, has no operational link to the IMF. Member countries frequently borrow from it, totaling about $11 billion throughout its history. Because these are small countries, so 11 billion is not so small. There is no conditionality. As you borrow, you get it. So there's a lot of fear that if you don't have conditionality, maybe the country will not repay. Well, in the case of FLAR, which has been operating for 35 years, there has never been a single case of default. Okay? Even though the country may be defaulting on some other facility, say IMF default, but it never default on the regional facility. And that's because of the sense of ownership. So the fear of default should really be minimized in the case of developing a regional facility. So I think CMM should follow this kind of experience. So when members request drawing from the CMMPL or the IMF unlinked part, approval should be almost automatic, unless the only exception is when it is clear that the member will be insolvent shortly. Okay? And that, of course, AMRO will need to be the one doing the surveillance to make sure what is the status of that economy. And also, if the possibility of the country being able to repay is very low. So to cover such cases, we can have objective and transparent criteria can be developed to limit the amount of drawing that a country can access automatically. However, it should be noted that even when Thailand went completely bankrupt, we had $40 billion of short-term foreign debt. And we had net reserve of only 2.8 billion in July 1997. Yet we turned around the situation within 2 years. In 2 years, we said we don't need any more money from the IMF, and therefore we did not have to abide by any of their conditional analysis after that. So in fact, countries in this part of the world are export-oriented, so you can actually recover in terms of if the currency depreciates, your export goes up, import goes down, and your exchange reserve can increase very quickly. Okay. So the amount of drawing available to members without linking to the IMF needs to be increased. In fact, I think for the precautionary line, there should be no link to the IMF. That is, if a country wants to draw in a relatively short maturity, 6 to 9 months, the IMF link should be removed. That is, you give the country a benefit of the doubt, saying that, okay, you have a liquidity problem, not a crisis. Therefore, we're willing to extend money to you 6 to 9 months. Of course, if after 6 to 9 months, situation does not improve, then the probability that this is not a liquidity problem, but more of a crisis goes up. And then you can begin to have more conditionality. So the crisis prevention facility that could maybe a country can access for 6 to 9 months should be similar to the facility in Latin America of FLA. But then if the situation becomes more of a crisis situation, then the IMF will be involved. It will be more like a crisis situation. So conclusion, financial globalization has increased rapidly over the past 25 years and has been accompanied by phases of volatile capital flows. Emerging market economies are particularly susceptible to the risk from these volatile flows, leading to periods of stress or financial crisis throughout almost all regions of the world. Emerging market economies need to make use of appropriate policy tools, including monetary and exchange rate policy, reserves accumulation, and when needed, capital control and macroprudential measures. Basically, use all necessary measures that can help to ride through the storm and avoid crises. In addition, liquidity support mechanisms through international cooperation, whether bilateral, global, or regional, can make a critical difference in times of stress. Bilateral arrangements are by nature political, so may not be reliable for many countries. Global, IMF, and East Asian regional arrangement, CMIM, still do not have effective design that will make them attractive to countries in the region. Some recommendations were put forward on how these facilities can be modified to make them more attractive and effective. Thank you very much.